Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of State of Mind. This will be Part 25, Chapter 17, entitled The Darker the Weather. There was a bit of time while the three heroes waited for Izuku's doctor to join them, since she was currently in surgery with Izuku. In that time, Shota called the boy's mother, and within an hour she was entering Yagi's hospital room, with his permission, while the others mentally prepared themselves to deal with the woman. When Inko Midoriya walked into the room, they were all shocked by how short she was, which really shouldn't have been a surprise considering how small in stature Izuku was. Aside from that, she looked quite a lot like her son, or her son looked a lot like her, rather. The same long green hair, except hers was straight, where Izuku's was wavy. She had the same bright green eyes and the same shy countenance. "Hello, Mrs. Midoriya. It's nice to finally meet you," Hisashi said, uncharacteristically passive-aggressively, eyes narrowed. Shota gritted his teeth and resisted the urge to stomp his husband's foot. "Hello. Nice to meet you, too." The woman gave a small wave, either having missed that harsh jab by Mike or choosing to ignore it. "I'm Toshinori Yagi," Yagi said from his seated spot on his bed. "Those two are Aizawa and Present Mike. We're all teachers at UA. Inko gave a small bow. "Thank you for taking care of my son." Hisashi snorted, crossing his arms. Shota jabbed him in the ribs with an elbow, and then looked at Midoriya. She was watching them, a guilty expression flashing across her face. "The doctor should be here as soon as they get out of surgery with Izuku." Yagi sighed, ignoring his co-worker's antics. "Surgery?" The woman gulped. Shota raised a brow at that, but before he could say anything, Hisashi answered, practically spitting his words. "It's not like this is his first surgery recently." "All right, Yagi, we'll be right back," Shota said and grabbed Hisashi's arm, dragging him out of the room to stand in the hallway. "Zashi, I know you're mad, and you don't like her, but you've got to control yourself." Shota sighed in exasperation. Hisashi looked at him over the top of his glasses. "I'm not just mad, Sho. I'm pissed. She didn't come when Izuku had brain surgery. She wasn't there for anything after the USJ. She wasn't there after Izuku was assaulted in the mall. It took her own son being kidnapped by the League to even show her face." Hisashi was steadily growing louder, until Shota was forced to use his quirk. "Hisashi, please," Shota grumbled and released his quirk, pulling eye drops from his belt. "Sorry, Sho." Hisashi sighed and leaned against the wall, taking a deep breath. "I can control myself now, sorry." Shota narrowed his eyes, and Hisashi raised his hands. "Don't look at me like that. I'll control myself, jeesh." He nudged Shota playfully, who just shook his head before walking back into the hospital room together. Midoriya had seated herself in a chair in the corner of the room. Yagi looked up when they entered, and seemed relieved that they were back. Shota imagined being alone with her after everything was quite awkward. "Mrs. Midoriya was just asking where Izuku has been staying," Yagi stated, his voice nervous, probably unsure what to reveal about Shota and Hisashi. "He's been staying with me," Shota answered, lifting his chin, choosing to leave out the fact that Izuku stayed with both he and Hisashi. The public would have a field day if they knew Present Mike lived with another hero. They would go even crazier if they knew he was married to said hero. "His teacher?" Midoriya frowned in confusion. "I took temporary custody of Izuku after his brain surgery. He needed someone to keep an eye on him while he recovered. He lives alone after all," Shota said, utterly tonelessly, but the weight of the words was there, and Midoriya looked down at her hands, fiddling them together, almost exactly like how Izuku did when he was anxious or nervous. The thought irritated Shota for some reason. "I don't," she began. A succinct knock on the door was the only warning before a woman walked in, gazing at each and every one of them. "I'm here to debrief everyone on Izuku Midoriya's condition. Is everyone here for him?" Yagi nodded in answer to her question. The 3 UA teachers and one mother faced the doctor that stood before them. She was on the shorter side, and wore an almost neon green pixie cut and a severe expression, contrasting sharply with the tiny pink earrings on her ears and her sparkly pink lanyard around her neck. She was looking at all three of them now, glowing pink eyes narrowed. Pink seemed to be a theme with this doctor, whose name tag read Dr. Kumiko, Shota thought. Yagi nodded for her to begin, and she inhaled, as if she needed to prepare herself. Every hero in that room tensed. And then she started. "We'll start off with the most severe and work our way down, all right? Please hold your questions until I finish." Everyone nodded. Izashi was sweating, grimacing at the connotation behind those words. How many injuries must the kid have sustained for the doctor to be acting like this? The doctor started. "Midoriya had a minor brain bleed, not major enough to need a craniotomy like before, but it did cause a seizure while we were operating. So we gave him some anti-epileptic medication to quell that, but it could be a problem in the future." Shota's brow creased, and Hisashi subtly grabbed his hand, squeezing. "About 15% of his body was covered in severe burns that required debridement and/or skin grafts. He also had many gashes and lacerations that required hundreds of stitches. He had 5 broken ribs, some puncturing his lungs, which also required surgery to fix, and that had to be done as quickly as possible. He also has deep tramline bruising along his torso, and we are unsure what could have caused it." Yagi visibly paled at that, but the doctor went on, not noticing. "Midoriya also had the beginning of an infection in his blood, septicemia, but that is currently being treated with antibiotics and shouldn't cause any issues. He had a concussion as well as being dehydrated, and his red and white blood cell counts were extremely low, which were contributing to his anemia and the other factors that I mentioned. He is also suffering from severe quirk exhaustion, which matches what Mr. Yagi said happened." She gestured to Yagi. "We're going to keep Midoriya in a medicated coma for at least 2 days so that he can restore some of his strength before waking up." At that, the doctor sighed. "His mental state is worrisome. We have no idea what he will be like when he wakes up. People that have gone through the things that he has, well, he's going to need people that care about him there for him." "We'll be there," Hisashi answered firmly, and so quickly that it was almost an interruption. "We'll take care of the little listener." He resisted the urge to glare daggers at the green-haired woman in the corner. "Okay, good. I'm sure you're all wondering when you can see him." There was rapid nodding. "He won't be waking for some time, but you can see him now if you want. There are several students waiting to see him too, but I'm limiting it to 2 people at a time." "Oh," Yagi frowned. "Tsukauchi told me he sent the students home." The doctor only shrugged. "Thank you." Shota nodded his gratitude to the doctor, and she left, the door falling shut behind her. Hisashi and Shota both glanced at Midoriya and sighed. "We'll check on the students if you want to see your son first, Mrs. Midoriya." The woman nodded and thanked them before leaving the room to find someone to tell her where Izuku's room was. After she was gone, Hisashi immediately turned to Shota. "I don't care what she says. Izuku is staying with us," he said, his nose scrunched up in anger. "Zashi, I don't get the impression that she is going to try to keep that from happening." He sighed. "Now, let's go lecture some students." The next day, the teachers had a meeting with Nezu, and eventually ended up deciding another week for everyone to recover, including Izuku, would not be remiss. They all agreed, and then had the receptionist record a call to send out to all the students' families. After that, they discussed the dorm system. The week off gave ample time for the dorms to be constructed and for the teachers to go out to all the parents in person to give permission for the students to live on campus, which began the day after the meeting, the day Izuku was due to wake up. After those were finished, Shota headed back to the hospital with Yagi to get an update from the doctor and to be near Izuku. He would be waking up any time, and they were trying to keep someone in the room at all times just in case he did wake up and was scared. His quirk was too destructive for him to wake up and lash out at someone. According to Yagi, the things the kid had done when Yagi rescued him had been near unbelievable. The hero described a hellscape and then mentioned something that he had seen in Izuku's mindscape almost half a year prior that he had somehow forgotten about. And how the man could have forgotten something like that was really lost on Shota, but whatever. Hisashi was out on patrol, and Izuku's mother was who knows where. So it was just Yagi and Shota by themselves at Izuku's bedside for some time, the sounds of the machines whirring around them. Izuku was unconscious between them, looking as rough as could be expected after what he had gone through. A nurse or someone must have washed the kid's hair, though, because it was no longer coated in blood and filth and was splayed out against the pillow in curls and waves of green. His face had been cleaned now, too, and all the bruises and cuts were revealed in striking clarity. Izuku's body was still, and his heart rate was even and calm, though Shota was worried for when he woke up. He'd seen the damage the kid could cause from just a nightmare. What about waking up after a literal kidnapping and torture? After several hours of nothing happening, except a nurse coming in to check on Izuku and mentioning that he should be waking up any time, Hisashi returned from his patrol, his hair crooked, and bloodstains on his knuckles. Shota stared at him as he handed him a cup of coffee, looking pointedly at his knuckles. "What did you do, Hisashi?" Hisashi shrugged. "I was in a bad mood, so I found a gang fight and I broke them." "You broke them up?" Yagi glanced back at Hisashi from his spot by Izuku's bed. Hisashi looked at the hero over the top of his glasses, eyes glinting. "No, I broke them." Shota sighed and gestured for the voice hero to pull up a seat to sit next to him and to be ready. Izuku was beginning to stir, his fingertips twitching and his eyes rolling beneath their lids. He had been doing that for some time now, as if struggling out of a deep sleep, and Shota had been sitting on the edge of his seat on standby for a while, anticipating the worst. Hisashi began rambling on about something Nezu had done when suddenly the kid's eyes snapped open, green lightning exploding from his body. Shota activated his quirk, hair floating above him as the kid's heart rate accelerated dramatically, and he lashed out, trying to sit up, breathing erratically. Yagi panicked, eyes wide, and jumped forward, trying to hold his successor down so he didn't tear his many stitches or hurt himself in some other way. Izuku was keening in the back of his throat, kicking out while Hisashi hastily spammed the call button with his index finger. Shota was forced to blink, and Yagi cried out as Izuku's quirk-powered fist connected with his chin, knocking him back. Shota quickly reactivated Erasure as a nurse rushed in, taking in the scene skillfully and grabbing a syringe from a drawer and filling it with a bottle from a cabinet. Meanwhile, Izuku had backed up against his headboard, eyes flicking around the room wildly. Hisashi had stood and was murmuring to him, hands raised, trying unsuccessfully to get him to calm down. The nurse rushed to Izuku's IV and injected the bag with whatever was in the syringe. Izuku looked up at the nurse in fear, pupils dilated to almost envelop his entire eye. Hisashi took the chance to try to console the boy by patting his hair, which he always seemed to like. Not this time. Izuku's leg flashed up, and he kicked Shota's husband straight in the throat. A strangled squawk burst from Hisashi, and he dropped to the ground, coughing. Shota was grimacing, eyes burning. Yagi stood back up, and Izuku looked at him, head bobbing against his chest as whatever the nurse had given him started to go into effect. "It's all right, young Izuku," Yagi whispered, rubbing his jaw. "You can relax." Izuku sagged against his pillow, eyes half-lidded. Shota finally released his quirk and groaned, rubbing his eyes with one hand and digging in a belt pouch for his eye drops with the other. "That should calm him down, but it wears off rather quickly. Are you two all right?" The nurse looked at Hisashi and Yagi worriedly. Yagi nodded, and Hisashi forced out an enthusiastic yeah that sounded more like a croak than anything. She narrowed her eyes, but looked back to Shota, who seemed to be the most competent of them at the moment. "Please, call a nurse if he starts acting up again." She glanced at Izuku, frowning, approaching the bed to check his bandages and stitches, and to fix his IV line. "Poor kid," she murmured, sticking some tape back down that he had dislodged in his panic. She leaned back and sighed, before waving to the heroes and exiting the room. Shota finished with his eye drops and put them away, rubbing at his eyes and grumbling to himself. "I hate seeing him like that," Hisashi rumbled as he climbed back into his seat. Yagi nodded, frowning deeply at his protege, as he sat utterly still in his bed, his arms wrapped around himself. "Izuku," "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Izuku didn't answer or even move, continuing to stare down at his blankets. "Fuck, this is a mess," Shota growled. There was a sudden knock on the door, and then Inko Midoriya walked into the room, frowning when she caught sight of Izuku sitting up and not acknowledging anyone. "What happened?" "Where were you?" Hizashi said, his voice low and threatening sounding, after being kicked in the throat. Inko leaned away from him, frowning. Shota sighed and then explained. "He panicked when he woke up, so they had to give him something." The woman frowned but nodded, pulling a small bag from her purse and setting it on the counter off to the side. "I brought his favorite candy, or it at least used to be his favorite." She looked down at her fingers, wringing them nervously. To fill the silence, Yagi spoke up. "UA is installing a dorm system." Inko looked up at that, brows raising. "Really?" Shota leaned back in his chair, eyes not leaving his ward. "Technically, since I am his temporary guardian, we don't actually need your permission for him to move in. But it wouldn't hurt." She made a sound in the back of her throat and looked at her son, guilt written across her face. He still hadn't moved. Her forehead creased and several emotions seemed to be battling for control of her face before finally settling on resignation, and she nodded. Shota pulled a paper from a small briefcase he had brought in with him. He handed it to the woman with a pen, and she scanned it before reading it and signing her name, and then handed it back. Shota then handed her another paper, as Hizashi pulled out his phone to film. "What is this?" she asked, taking the paper with a frown. "Transfer of full legal guardianship," Shota answered dryly. Yagi started from the other side of the bed, looking at them in surprise. "What?" Inko watched him in shock. "You aren't around. With Izuku living on campus, I will need to be able to make emergency medical decisions as his guardian. You do know he has quite a few medical conditions, correct?" Shota raised a brow at her. She swallowed thickly, tears pricking at her eyes as the paper sat on her lap, her fingertips tapping together. "I know that he has PTSD from his father a long time ago, but I assumed it was better." Hizashi scoffed from behind the camera, remembering all the times he and Shota had to wake Izuku up from debilitating nightmares. Shota ignored him and spoke. "Izuku has very bad PTSD, and it is only going to be worse after everything that has happened. He has depression, panic disorder, anxiety, anemia, and more. Possibly even epilepsy now." Shota's voice hardened. "Izuku trusts me. It took a long time to get to this point, and with you not being around, I need to be able to help him when he needs it." "If he wasn't in UA, would these injuries even have happened?" Her own voice hardened in response to Shota's. Hizashi leaned forward with irritation. "I know for a fact that something worse would probably have happened if he hadn't joined UA and made the friends that he has now." Inko paled, remembering Izuku's 11th birthday and what he had done, how she had reacted. She looked down, wringing her hands together more violently. Shota gritted his teeth. "You will still be his mother. You will still be able to see him if you want, but honestly, nothing will really change for you." Inko flinched at his harsh words, but he was right. "Just say you're signing of your own free will. Sign, and then we'll take care of the rest." There was a moment of silence as Inko twisted her hands together and looked at her son. She took in the long, fluffy hair covering one eye. She took in the bandages all over his face, the wrapped arms, and the white bandages showing at the top of his mint green hospital shirt, the scar peeking through the short hair on his right side, the huge scar on his throat. There was such a history of pain written on her son's skin. For once in her life, Inko Midoriya would do what was best for her son. She picked the pen up from her lap and signed the paper while speaking to the camera that Hizashi held up. "I am signing this paper transferring legal guardianship to Aizawa Shota and Hizashi Yamada of my own free will." She glanced up briefly in confusion when she saw the other name. Who was that? She finished and set the pen down, looking up. "Who is Hisashi Yamada?" she asked. Shota sighed and gestured to his side. "Mike is. He is my husband. We would rather it not be public knowledge." "Ah," Inko nodded. "I won't tell anyone." She handed the paper and pen back to Shota and then stood, smoothing her skirt down with her palms. "I should probably go. Please," she bit her cheek, struggling not to cry. "Please call me if you need anything." She turned to leave, but a small voice stopped her. "Mom," it said so gently she barely heard it, and she turned, hesitantly. Izuku was looking up, head tilted, his hair covering half his face. Her son lifted an arm as if it was the heaviest thing in the world, but she knew what he wanted, and she practically threw herself forward. Yagi jumped back, scooting his chair to make room for her. Inko wrapped her arms around her son for the first time in years, carefully avoiding the lines connected to him. He set his forehead against her shoulder and let his arm drop back down to the blanket, allowing Inko to just hold him. The others in the room made themselves busy, feeling like they were intruding on a private moment. Silent tears were fully streaming down her face when Inko eventually drew back from the embrace, and she wiped at her face, sniffling. "Be well, Izuku," she murmured, backing away. She bowed to each hero in the room, hiding her face, before turning and leaving, the door gently falling closed. All three heroes looked back at the child, who looked smaller than ever, his head facing down again. Yagi stiffened when he caught sight of water droplets falling from the boy's eyes. "Young Izuku." Izuku didn't show any sign of having heard Yagi, continuing to cry silently, bandaged hands lax, his body still. Yagi looked at Shota and Mike, grimacing. Shota shrugged, and Yagi drew his eyes together. That was not very helpful at all. Yagi shuffled forward, bringing a still bandaged arm up and around the boy, drawing him against his shoulder. Izuku allowed Yagi to hug him, but he didn't move. At least he hadn't flinched, but Yagi had a feeling that the kid didn't even know that he was there. After a bit, Yagi released him, and the boy slid to his other side, pulling himself into a ball, staring at the medical equipment next to the bed. Izuku didn't speak to anyone for the rest of the day. No matter what anyone did or said, he would flinch when someone tried to touch him, even the nurses who came to check on him to change bandages. He remained laying on his side, unmoving, far past when the medicine should have worn off, and late into the next day. The heroes always made sure one of them was with Izuku at all times, Yagi staying there when Hisashi and Shota went to settle the paperwork they had filled out with Inko Midoriya. It took surprisingly little effort, especially with the video Hisashi had taken. The two stopped at a store, and then their apartment on the way back to the hospital, picking some things up for Izuku to try to cheer him up. When they had reached the room, they found everything much the same as they had left it. Izuku still laid on his side, and Yagi was reading a book, now on the couch against the back of the room. "How is he?" Hisashi asked as Shota shut the door behind them. Yagi shut his book, glancing at Izuku. "No different. He still won't eat anything." Yagi gestured at the untouched tray of food on the counter. "Some of his classmates came to visit him, but he had no response. Young Todoroki in particular seems saddened by the lack of reaction." "Well, we brought someone to help," Hisashi said, glancing at Shota as he unzipped the bag that he had carried carefully in. Immediately, a one-eyed cat sprang out of it and shook herself from head to tail, then turned to glare at Shota. "Hey, don't look at me like that." The hero raised his hands. "Look." He pointed to the boy in the bed, and Wink turned back around, catching sight of Izuku. She immediately leapt straight from that spot, onto Yagi's legs, claws digging in if his yelp said anything, and onto Izuku's hospital bed. She then gently stepped onto his hip and climbed to his neck to tap at his nose. Hizashi was reminded of Izuku's first morning with them, when Wink had used that same technique to wake him up. "You brought a cat?" Yagi seemed confused, raising a brow at them. "Not just any cat. Wink," Hizashi explained. "Look." Izuku blinked, inhaling sharply as his eyes went cross-eyed in an attempt to see what was batting at him. The teachers collectively held their breath as the kid slowly rolled onto his back, Wink moving with him to sit on his chest. The two stared at each other for what felt like the longest time and showed a worry that it had been a bad idea to bring Wink. But then, something changed. Izuku's lip quivered, and his eyes scrunched up, his breath catching. Suddenly, Izuku took Wink, pulling her to his chest and rolling back to his side, folding himself around her as he erupted into violent, entire-body-shaking sobs. Wink tilted her head back, mashing it into Izuku's face, trying to help him in ways humans never could. Yagi jumped up, eyes wide in concern, and Hizashi moved forward, their hands hovering uselessly over Izuku's form, afraid to touch him and scare him. Hizashi looked over at Shota worriedly, the only sounds in the room being the heart monitor and Izuku's choked sobs. Shota grimaced and shrugged. There wasn't much they could do except just be there for this. Izuku needed time. Eventually, the sobs faded out, and Izuku released his death grip on Wink. She stood and head-putted Izuku's face, holding the position as if psychically communicating with him through head-to-head contact. After a minute of that, Izuku pushed himself into a sitting position on shaking arms. He rubbed at his reddened, swollen eyes and looked at each person in the room for the first time since he had been rescued. "Hey, little listener," Hizashi murmured, lifting a hand as if he wanted to tussle Izuku's hair. Izuku tensed, leaning away. Hizashi gritted his teeth. To have come so far and then be brought back here tore at Hizashi's heart. "Young Izuku, are you all right?" Yagi asked softly. Izuku opened his mouth, but no sound came out, and he closed it, shaking his head before dropping it, his hair falling to cover his face. Yagi sighed, and had to resist the urge to offer some sort of physical comfort, such as rubbing his back. He couldn't stop thinking about the way the boy had flinched when he had first tried to soothe him back at the bar. They stayed like that for some time, until eventually both Yagi and Shota had to leave for work. Hizashi, having finished his patrol, stayed. Shota had taken Wink back home too, but just seeing her had helped Izuku immensely. Hizashi could tell, and he knew it had been a good idea. Hizashi remained through the night, because as soon as he started to leave after visiting hours, Izuku began panicking and the nurses deemed it was safest for the voice hero to stay. He washed up in a nearby sink, attempting to remove all the hair products from his hair before returning to Izuku's side. The kid was sitting up, looking down at his hands without moving. "Izuku," Hizashi spoke. "Do you think you could try to eat now?" No answer. And that was how it stayed until Hizashi somehow fell asleep, with his head on Izuku's bed, only to wake up several hours later with the nurse telling him they needed to take Izuku for another brain scan. When he looked up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, he found Izuku sitting in the exact same position he remembered him being in before he had fallen asleep, and he frowned, sitting up and watching them wheel Izuku away, making sure that the little listener didn't panic. Today marked the 4th day since the rescue, and Izuku hadn't eaten anything, and now he was pretty sure the kid hadn't slept since he had first woken up, which had been 2 days ago already. Hizashi was worried. Hizashi stood up and cracked his back against his hands, frowning before glancing at his watch. It was a little past 6, which meant that Shota should be back any time. In the meantime, Hizashi could check his emails and messages. There were a lot to respond to. Shota did end up arriving before Izuku was brought back, and together they spoke with Izuku's doctor again. She was explaining that Izuku would be able to go home soon, but that he should be under constant surveillance, at least at first, to prevent harm to himself. "Do you think that is a possibility?" Hizashi asked her nervously. "I do," Dr. Kumiko answered confidently. Shota frowned. "In cases similar to his, it's not unheard of for victims to seek a way out or a release from the pain inside." She tapped her head. And with his history, it will be a good idea to keep an eye on it. The couple realized at the same time that now that they were actually Izuku's guardians, they would be able to see his full medical history. They both just nodded stiffly. "You know of his history with depression and SI, correct?" Dr. Kumiko asked. "Some," Shota answered, familiar with the term. Dr. Kumiko nodded and sighed before going on to discuss Izuku's medication. It was a long list, and by the time she finished, Izuku was returning, curled up on the bed as the nurses brought it back. Izuku was shaking, his face buried in his arms, his hair a mess. One of the nurses broke off from the group and approached them, her mouth set in a grim line. "We had to sedate him again." Shota sighed, and Hisashi drew a hand down his face, groaning. "When can we take him home?" Shota asked, exasperated. "He hates beds. I know that's why he's not sleeping. He'll be much more comfortable at home with his cat." "I would like him to stay for the rest of the day so we can monitor his blood levels and keep an eye out for seizures and sickness. If his levels are good by tomorrow, he can go home. I would also like for him to see a psychiatrist soon. I can give you some recommendations just in case he can't get with his own psychiatrist in enough time." The two nodded and accepted a card from the doctor before leaving her and heading into the room where some of the nurses were getting things set up. Hisashi thanked them for their work while Shota settled into his usual seat, sighing in relief at sitting down after a long patrol. "Please, try to get him to eat," one of the nurses requested of Hisashi before leaving with the others. Hisashi inhaled, long and deep, before crossing the room to his husband and bending at the waist to envelop him in a hug. "How was your patrol?" he finally asked. "It was fine," Shota grumbled, eyes on the boy in front of him. Hisashi huffed but released his husband. "I'm going to run home and make Izuku katsudon. He has never turned it away before. That's the last thing I can think of to get him to eat." Shota nodded. "Okay, I'll stay here with him and look over his charts and medical history. I've been meaning to anyway." Hisashi nodded and kissed his forehead before leaving. Shota stretched his legs out, wrinkling his brow. The kid still hadn't eaten or spoken. Shota didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to help him. For the time being, he decided that knowing as much as possible about him would be the best option. So he stepped out of the room and requested for a nurse to give him Izuku's complete medical history, or at least as much as they legally could. When that finally arrived, Shota settled in with a cup of hospital coffee and began the light reading. All right, listeners, this concludes the first half to Chapter 17 of State of Mind. The second half to this chapter will be up next. Let me know your thoughts and reactions to this one. There's a lot that happened here, and I'm really excited for the next part of this. So drop your thoughts, reactions, comments below. And as always, thank you all so much for listening.